Hello and welcome to the Learning Matters podcast. My name is Ted Bauer. I'm a web producer with Learning Matters. And in this edition, I got to speak with Doug Lynch, who is both a professor and a vice dean at the University of Pennsylvania. This was about a 36-minute discussion on all facets of education, kind of starting with education entrepreneurship and Mr. Lynch's business plan competition, which we'll hear a lot about, and then kind of going to a macro level about the education field as a whole. It's a very interesting conversation. I hope you guys out there enjoy it as much as I enjoyed getting to do the interview. And if you stick around at the end, you can get some more information on what's coming next week and some more things going on at the Learning Matters site. Thanks a lot and enjoy. If you could just trace a little bit of your own career, we can get into the specifics of the entrepreneurial program in a few minutes, but if you just kind of want to talk about some of the things you've done and kind of how you got towards this place, that would probably be the best contextual introduction.
So I've been working in higher ed for almost 25 years, and within the world of higher ed, I have played around with what you might roughly call either innovation or reform in different areas. So at ASU, I helped start one of the country's first charter schools. Arizona and Minnesota were really the two states that first charter school laws, and so I was working for the president of ASU, and he sort of saw this opportunity with the charter school laws to bluntly leverage state dollars and sort of codify what we were doing as ancillary support for students to improve their chances of succeeding at the university level, particularly students of color, age under credit students. And that was in the, I guess, early 90s. And I moved into e-learning and was sort of an early adopter of e-learning, both at Arizona State and then at NYU, and did a lot of work using technology to deliver learning to folks. And because of that, the two groups who initially were consuming distance learning were people overseas and working adults. And so I started to sort of focus a lot on sort of what you might call international education and work-based education. And then I started to solve problems for organizations that had learning issues. So I did all of WorldCom's ethics training, coupled with the SEC, 86,000 students in 10 different languages. And then I did the fire department after 9/11 because everybody who knew how to put out a fire in a high-rise had been killed. They had an experiential curriculum. They hadn't sort of codified stuff. And so we brought a bunch of colleges together to help around that. So, and then I moved to the University of Pennsylvania to the ed school. So I'm in my first ed school. And
this is only the first time you've worked technically in an ed school capacity.
Correct.
Okay.
So largely I tended to work in Central University rather than sort of in a particular school, though all the action ultimately is at the school level rather than at the university level. And have come to realize is that, one, learning's ubiquitous everywhere. So little kids, K-12, higher ed, corporate, retired people in AARP who want to sort of improve their understanding of art history. It's all in some ways the same sort of problem. It's a people problem. The context requires variance, but one of the things I find fascinating is none of these folks talk to each other. And so I started at Penn to build a portfolio of programs that were, I guess, perceived as somewhat innovative in that they were non-traditionally focused. They took working adults. You can think of most higher education as pre-service. You go to college, and then you go out and you apply what you knowledge. Now,
Right.
I'm interested in a feedback loop where you worked and learned and worked and learned, and you did both sort of concurrently. In the same way that doctors, for example, are developed. And so at Penn, I've got a portfolio of programs, everything from people who head up school districts or their principals or they're headmasters at private schools or they are higher education administrators, but they all follow that model. And we don't use adjuncts. We use our own faculty, which is also different than most other programs in the country like that. And they are all perceived as fairly successful, relatively and economically for the school. And then from that, people started to say, well, why don't you teach students in the school how you're doing what you're doing? Because there's all this buzz about reform and innovation. You're sort of this, guy who's doing all this reform and innovation, but you're not teaching other people how to do it. So I started teaching courses in educational entrepreneurship, and, we get like 8 students or 10 students. Now I have 60 students. I get them from all over the university. Rather than do an academic course where we might look at the literature around entrepreneurship, I was like, well, what I want to do is have you design and pitch education ventures. I don't care whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit. They can be about solving any learning problem anywhere in the world for little kids or adults, but let's just do that. I started bringing in friends of mine from the philanthropic world and from the venture capital world to be the judges for the final class.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of for a simulation of what it would be like to pitch and ask for money from somebody. And every year somebody get picked up. Wow, gee, maybe there's something to this. And then I started talking to these friends of mine who are these philanthropists and venture capitalists, and then I know all these folks like, the KIPP schools and Teach for America, as well as University of Phoenix and Sesame Street. So I know all these entrepreneurs in education, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit. I knew all the funders. I said, well, we should get together and talk about why is this so hard? And then from that, that's when we started doing the business plan competition, and we're doing an incubator and trying to set up a venture capital fund. And I think more than anything else, we're trying to create a sandbox where everybody who is interested in change together to share experiences, to see if there's opportunities to collaborate a lot. That's about 3 years.
What are the next couple of steps in the arc, in your opinion?
Right. So, the fundamental thing to realize is that, education is huge when you sort of frame it the way.
Massive.
Sort of corporate America. It's bigger than healthcare.
Really? That I did not actually know.
Early childhood, K-12, higher ed, and corporate.
Right.
That all up. It sort of rivals healthcare.
Right. And what is corporate education? Is that like training of CEOs, or are you talking about like testing services and stuff?
So training of CEOs and employees. So I was just talking to somebody who is at Walmart. He's got 2.1 million students. He has to train them. He's training them all the time.
Right.
And he's training them for everything from compliance and customer service to he's doing leadership development of rising managers. Folks have organized themselves in corporate universities, and some of them have accreditation, and it's 50% of working adults are going through this. And the education world has no idea that this is going on.
Yes.
And then if you think about things like the military or medicine, largely what doctors and people in the military are doing when they're not sort of either saving lives or sort of fighting wars is learning.
Right.
So it's huge, and it's actually our country's 4th largest service export when you combine higher ed and sort of the corporate stuff. But there's no deal flow.
Right.
There's no ecosystem. So in healthcare, for example, NIH funds basic research, and you have these sort of lab scientists who are doing, trying to understand the nature of cells. And then that informs people who do applied research. And then there are offices of technology transfer that sort of help bring those to angel investors and venture capitalists who then sort of invest it and sort of grow it and then sell it off, and Merck or Pfizer buys it, right? There's a whole ecosystem designed to take innovation and bring it to the marketplace.
Do you think that maybe one of the reasons that doesn't happen in ed is just because people hadn't even thought that innovation needed to come to the marketplace before?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. I think it's a great question. So from the student point of view, no. University of Phoenix would not have 550,000 students if there wasn't a recognition both by the University of Phoenix and the students that there was an unmet need in the marketplace.
Right.
They didn't even see the need. So I think it's more that so I have several biases here. One, I'm trained as an economist, and if I look at the way whether it's the federal government or the major foundations play, they have theories of change. And I would equate this to being a gambler.
Mm-hmm.
They think that they're right. They think there's one algorithm, one silver bullet, one reform, whether it is charter schools or distance learning or whatever it is, that is going to solve the world's problems in every single context, in every single subject, for every single student.
That is a major concern, that
and
people do think that
patently untrue.
100% untrue.
If you think about medicine, so when they figured out that aspirin helped with headaches,
right.
researchers didn't stop thinking about what other drugs might sort of reduce pain in your head. And they even experiment and recognize that certain drugs work well for certain people and don't work well at all for other people. And some combinations work well and some combinations are toxic. They continue to innovate and evolve. And it just doesn't happen in education. In the formal sector, there's a lot more innovation happening, for example, in the corporate and the non-formal sector. Things that like Sesame Street does, or these sort of, leapfrog and those sort of things. But for school, Plato's Academy.
Do you think that if there was a model that could be created and was sustainable whereby teachers and principals got paid more, do you think that that would shift the whole paradigm in terms of, the people you'd have coming in and the capacity to innovate? Or do you think that that's too simplistic of a argument?
I think there's sort of separate answers to that.
Right.
The empirical evidence on salaries being the biggest driving force doesn't seem to really play out that well.
Okay.
So Goldhaber writes about this from one perspective, and Ingersoll writes about it from another perspective, but they would ultimately agree that if you made the working conditions better, there's a whole bunch of other things you'd have to do to change, because teachers aren't in it just for the money.
Right.
Do I think they would all like to get paid more? Sure. But there's a bunch of other things that probably would be more impactful. I'm doing a project with a bunch of boarding schools. Boarding schools get paid less than public school teachers. Same with generally independent schools. Students, other things being equal, from like better colleges, if you will, right? They're getting better people and paying them less, but retaining them. Well, it's pretty nice to work at Exeter or St. Paul or Penn Charter, as opposed to, the Mississippi Delta or, the South Bronx. Really tough conditions, not a lot of support from the community or from the district, or, so you have to be a hero. We've painted this model, it's the Jaime Escalante model. If you just could be heroic, then you can overcome anything. And I think that is a lot to ask
of any individual.
The teachers we have in this country. The thing that sort of, again, I don't think, you have to think about it like a complex dynamic system. And even if we fixed the teacher problem, I think that we wouldn't solve everything. I think if we could figure out how to fix the teacher problem, whatever that problem might be, depending on who you ask, there's sort of different issues. Is it teacher quality? Is it working environments? Is it professional development? But even if we sort of all have spectacular teachers, that's one criterion that sort of matters in the system. And I don't think it would work everywhere.
I think that one thing, because I taught for like 3 or 4 years, and sometimes I think about going back into it, although I'm not completely at that point yet. But I think one thing, and it's refreshing to hear someone say it, I think that one thing that happens with debates about education is that people are always like, this one thing will solve it. Like, if you get more charters in an area, that'll solve it. Or if you pay teachers more, that'll solve it. Or if you redo teacher training and alternate certification models, that'll solve it. But in reality, it is, like anything in life, it's a complicated ecosystem where all the parts have to relate to each other in a certain way. So I know that was definitely like a frustration that I had when I was in teaching, because even other teachers will be like, well, the problem is that the district doesn't support our principal enough. And it's like, no, that's actually maybe 12% of the problem, but there's another 88 over here that you're not looking at.
Well, what I find, I just a couple days ago sort of got to spend a very short time with former President Clinton. He was talking about in the current state of the world, ideology seems to be driving things. So, for example, in education, I think if you ask the right, the left, the conservative, the liberal, the progressive, the libertarian, whether education matters, they'd all be like, yes. And then it gets ugly after that. Because people ignore evidence, and they don't seem to actually want to figure out what might work. They want to take a stance, whether you're sort of, hugely in favor of teachers and support teachers, and it's all about the teachers, or you are market-based reformed and the unions are a problem. Everybody gets really ideological. If you buy the argument that it's a complex adaptive system, that's like, spitting in the wind. I mean, it's just, and the irony is that all of them have some truth to their stance.
Of course, yeah.
But they don't want to work together to solve the problem. They would rather sort of take this stance and ignore, because they already know the answer in their mind, they sort of don't want to actually work the problem or investigate it or research it. And it just makes everything so contentious and problematic. And, it's fascinating to me, again, in this world of corporate learning, if, somebody sort of says, gee, we need to do this. We've got, people are sort of dying on the job. We've got to do some safety training. Next day, and then they evaluate. If it didn't work, okay, we got to do something. There's none, it's so politicized.
Yeah.
And I think it's endemic of a bigger problem we have in our society. But nothing gets more personal than schools because it's about kids and it's about neighborhood property values and
100%.
all these sorts of things. And it just gets so ugly in the way. And then everybody thinks their silver bullet is the panacea.
You had mentioned a few minutes ago that when you had first run some of the programs at Penn and you were inviting in your friends from philanthropy or venture capital, some of those projects have been getting picked up. So maybe if you could give one or two examples of some projects over the last couple of years that have been pitched to this panel you put together that actually had gotten picked up, just so people could have examples of what is coming out of the program.
Right. So there's sort of two layers to this. So there's my class, which is a very small N, and it's amazing to me that sort of in that small N, somebody's willing to sort of support their ideas. We've had somebody who was building an app for working moms to help them manage the schedule of their kids, somebody who designed a learning management system to compete with Blackboard. We had somebody who built a program that is kind of like College Board meets Travelocity to help sort of kids select college and then go visit them. Now, these are not panaceas. These are not big ideas that solve everything everywhere.
Right.
But that's kind of the point. And then in the business plan competition, which is open to anybody in the world, we have, hundreds of submissions, and we have, like 100 reviewers. And last year, for example, the guy who won, he was out of Silicon Valley, and he was also a Hoffman Fellow. And his idea was to build a Yelp around learning. Sort of find, if you wanted to learn Spanish, you'd sort of type it in and it would sort of pull together all the opportunities to learn either online or face-to-face based on sort of where you are. The year before, the team that won, they were from Texas. They had built an algorithm that, based on your keystrokes, could authenticate whether or not it was you on the computer, which was being sold to people who do online learning to authenticate for testing purposes.
Right, it's like a digital proctor thing, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So, but just the diversity of ideas the things that inspire me, I am hopeful in that it's been pretty easy to rally the entrepreneurs, at least, to come together, and the philanthropists and the funders, and get them all talking to each other and to support some of this stuff. But it's still very small scale. So 300 ideas in a year. And, even sort of giving away sort of $250,000 and then sort of giving them access to funders is a start. We need a Silicon Valley. We need this on a massive scale.
One thing that I thought was interesting, too, is that I think this was actually within the past week. There was an article in the Washington Post, and it was it goes back to some of the stuff you were talking about earlier about how a lot of discussions about education get way too over politicized. But
Yep.
there was an article in the Washington Post, and it was saying how, I think it was under the guise of an opinion article, but basically the opinion article was that the dot-com bubble burst at some point, and then since then, you could say various other quote-unquote bubbles have burst, and this guy was saying that he thought higher education was going to be the next thing to dry up or whatever. So, I mean, do you have any take on that or belief in that?
There's no evidence. So if you look at the world, so you have a knowledge economy, you have more of the world rising. I mean, look at India, 1 billion people. There are millions of them who want college education. Remember the demographics now. So, for all the sort of Obama administration push about the tragedy of people not graduating by the time they are 24 with a college degree, I would argue that there might be another thing going on, and that there's been a fundamental shift in that you're going to change careers 8, 9 times, or 5 times.
Yep.
There's this argument of maybe degree entropy, so some of what you learn might sort of not be valid, particularly in like the sort of, the technical sciences. So why would you front-end all of your learning if you're going to work for 50 years
Yeah.
to sort of get all your credentials by the time you're 24? Wouldn't you sort of stack your credentials and consume them over a longer period of time? And if you look at the data, it's something like 80% of Americans by the time they're 50 have had at least some college. I mean, so maybe we're being utterly rational. If you look at individual institutions, some are really challenged, right? Particularly sort of the classic liberal arts 4-year recruiting, particularly if they're not sort of highly selective. They're fighting for students. But at the same time, you have community colleges, which 30 years ago were like nowhere, which are like half of students. You've got University of Phoenix with 550,000. At the top universities, every year we sort of reject more and more and more people. You have more and more student visas sort of being applied to the United States. And you have New Zealand, Australia, both are saying as a national strategy, we want to recruit international students. So from a marketplace perspective, the demand for higher education seems to get more and more inelastic and higher and higher and higher. So it's both changing its angle and it's shifting to the right, which suggests that, higher ed isn't going anywhere. Does that mean certain institutions are not going to compete well? Absolutely. And I think there's some challenges there. But I think certainly Chaz Edelstein, University of Phoenix, is probably feeling pretty pressure from the federal government on some of the regulatory issues about the future. So I don't see higher education going anywhere.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about was, I know this is an issue that comes up when people talk about terms like innovation and technology with regard to education. But do you ever worry or do you ever see through the business submission plan and some of its executions this notion, and I feel like this happens, like my girlfriend's sister is a 6th grade teacher in D.C., and they just got all these iPads, like a funder thing to get 250 iPads for the school or whatever. And you go there, and it looks awesome because you have all these kids in inner city D.C. on iPads, but then if you really think about it, you're kind of like, I don't know what they're doing. And a lot of times the teacher doesn't seem to completely know what they're doing. So do you ever worry that maybe sometimes people are like, well, this school is technologically savvy, but in reality they just have the equipment and they don't really have the plan that goes with it?
Yep. So I think that's the key to it. Again, I'm not an anthropologist, but the way anthropologists think about tools is really interesting because you can't think about them I'm actually writing a piece with Dick Elmore about this right now where you can't think about the tool simply in terms of use or out of context, right?
Right,
so
100%.
Learning is ultimately an intellectual endeavor. Do I think that these tools provide some affordances? Absolutely. But if you don't think about the designing of it, if you don't really think about it, then what you're doing is giving somebody a pretty expensive piece of paper at the end of the day, right? So simply photocopying the textbook and putting the textbook in a PDF and then giving the student an iPad with a PDF of the textbook on it doesn't do anything particularly at all.
No.
But if you begin to think about, like, okay, now that we have this performance support tool that could follow the student, how do we use it? In some ways, the answer is we don't know yet. So think about, when Edison first invented the phonograph, could he predict hip hop? And I mean, there was a whole bunch of things that had to happen in between, right? Before DJs playing with, spinning records and doing that with the scratching and stuff, right? That was
right.
a long way away. I mean, he built it for something totally different. I think simply thinking that you can quickly engineer this is foolhardy. On the other hand, I believe in experimentation. I think here's this tool that might provide some affordances, and putting it in the hands of students and beginning to experiment around it, it's a right thing to do, but we shouldn't expect, and we ought to be okay with some failures in that. Some of these things might be like, well, that didn't work particularly well.
Right.
And it ought to be okay. So, yes, I think that there is a lot of hoopla about IT, and I think some of it is intriguing. I think some of it is junk. Largely, I think we're just beginning this journey, right? It's really only been the last couple of years where e-learning, I mean, when I was sort of first playing in the e-learning space, the vast majority of stuff, they would talk all about constructivism and student-centered, blah, 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 and then you realize somebody just took their lecture notes and sort of put them on a web page.
Right.
So ultimately, how it ends, sort of exactly analogous to sort of, so they have a cool new, piece of, but nobody's doing anything with it. I think it largely has to do with design. And I think we have to spend a lot more time thinking about the design issues and then to begin to experiment with it.
Before I let you go, if you just want to talk about your hopes for your program going forward and some of the next steps that you are hoping to enact in that space.
Yep. So, again, what I'm trying to do is create a sandbox to help foster Silicon Valley. And what I fundamentally believe is that in the knowledge economy, an ed school ought to be part of that ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is most ed schools are problematic. I think we're trying to be sort of the non-ed school. And one of the things we've learned is polling in the rest of the universities are a really good thing to do. So one of the things I'm very proud of is we're working with the whole universities on these issues, and then we're bringing together this weird mix from the left and the right and the higher. So I think what I want to see is more, as corny as that sounds. So I fundamentally believe that unlike some other challenges that the world faces, this one's solvable. We can do this, but we need to vector this. We're sort of like, it's like a prisoner's dilemma right now. Everybody's tripping over each other, and then because they all have this sort of ideology, it just gets really ugly. But if we could just sort of not orchestrate it like a symphony, but make it jazzy and just provide some structure to this, and allow for some experimentation and to maybe think about doing things differently and also recognize that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, we might be able to make some progress here. So I'm actually quite bullish on the future because I've been inspired at all. I mean, I get all these CEOs from not-for-profits and for-profits just saying, how can I help? And we're not giving them anything. And so I actually think people recognize how important this is. We keep growing exponentially every year, and we just I hired the guy who used to run NYU's film program, and we're now sort of we're doing documentaries on some of this stuff. I mean, I think we're just going to do more and more of this, and we also don't think we should be the only ones doing it. We need to have every school doing this, and we need to have companies doing this, and foundations doing this, and the government. I mean, the problem is both solvable and huge, so we have to sort of work at it. So I'm hoping that we simply become an example that others will steal from and do it at much bigger scale than we can as sort of, an Ivy. And but I actually have been inspired, as corny as it sounds, by how easy it has been to get people to come together to do these things. These things, when they come together, these people are just, and there's no sort of anger between the not-for-profits and the for-profits or everybody's sort of like, hey, we are all in this together. And this stuff matters.
Yeah,
It's great.
100%.
Drop in the bucket.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to my interview with Doug Lynch. As I said at the beginning, it was a fantastic interview to conduct. I hope you guys found it interesting as well. Next week on the podcast, we will have Natalie Millman, who is a professor at George Washington University and focuses on education and technology in many respects within her own work. That should be released on iTunes and our website on Wednesday, December 7th, so look for it. And in the meantime, enjoy the remainder of your week. And as always, feel free to check out learningmatters.tv, which is our website, for the most up-to-date information on what we're doing and our upcoming guests. Thanks a lot, and have a great week. Bye.